On the night of November the 9th, in the small town of Hollow Creek, a phone call came into the local sheriff's office that would haunt every officer who answered it for the rest of their careers. The caller didn't speak. For 11 seconds, there was only breathing. Then, a single sentence delivered in a voice so calm it would later be described in court documents as unnervingly serene. "I left her exactly where you'll find her." The line went dead. What followed was a 6-year investigation into a crime so meticulously planned, so psychologically calculated, that veteran detectives who had worked the case would later say it changed the way they understood the word evil. Not the loud, chaotic evil of rage or impulse, but something colder, something patient. This is the story of the Hollow Creek case. Stay with me to the end, because nothing in this investigation is what it first appears to be. Hollow Creek was the kind of town where nothing happened. Population 4,200. One traffic light. A diner that closed at 8 p.m. because nobody stayed out later than that. It was the kind of place people moved to specifically because nothing happened there. Detective Renata Voss had been with the Hollow Creek Sheriff's Department for 14 years. In that time, she'd handled drunk driving stops, the occasional bar fight, and exactly one homicide, a domestic dispute that had been solved within 6 hours. She was not prepared for what waited for her at the old Ash Grove Mill on the night of November 9th. The mill had been abandoned for almost 2 decades, ever since the textile company that owned it folded. Local teenagers used it to drink. Hunters sometimes camped near it during the season. Otherwise, it sat rotting at the edge of town, swallowed slowly by kudzu and silence. When Voss arrived with 2 patrol officers, the building was dark except for a single construction lamp, plugged into a portable generator, positioned with surgical precision to illuminate exactly one spot on the 2nd floor. Beneath that lamp lay the body of 26-year-old schoolteacher Marlene Castillo. She had been missing for 9 days. What disturbed Voss immediately wasn't the scene itself. Homicide detectives, even small-town ones, are trained for the worst. What disturbed her was the arrangement. Marlene's body had been positioned with care, her hands folded, her clothing untouched, undamaged, freshly laundered, as though someone had dressed her after the fact in clothes that weren't hers. Surrounding her, in a perfect circle, were 9 unlit candles, each one a different color. Each one burned exactly halfway down before being extinguished. There was no blood at the scene, no visible wound, no sign of struggle. The medical examiner would later determine the cause of death was a rare, slow-acting toxin, one requiring access to either pharmaceutical-grade chemistry or specialized agricultural supply. Time of death: approximately 6 days * before * the body was discovered, which meant whoever had done this had kept her somewhere else first, then moved her here, staged her, lit the candles, waited, and made the call. The crime wasn't an act of passion. It was a performance. And performances, Voss would learn, demand an audience. To understand why someone would do this to Marlene Castillo, investigators first had to understand who she was. By every account, Marlene was beloved. She taught 3rd grade at Hollow Creek Elementary. She volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends. She had no criminal record, no history of conflict, no obvious enemies. Her fiancé, a contractor named Dean Whitfield, was questioned extensively and ultimately cleared. He'd been 3 states away at a job site with a verified timeline corroborated by 7 co-workers. Voss interviewed nearly 60 people in the first 2 weeks. Family, co-workers, students' parents, neighbors, members of her church group. The picture that emerged was almost frustratingly ordinary. Marlene Castillo was, by every measure, a good person living a small, good life. which made the staging of her death even more disturbing. Whoever did this hadn't killed out of hatred. The careful clothing, the candles, the deliberate absence of violence, it didn't read as punishment. It read as ritual. Voss brought in forensic psychologist Dr. Adrian Kessler, a consultant who had worked with 3 different state police departments on offender profiling. Kessler studied the crime scene photographs for nearly 4 hours before saying a word. "This isn't rage," he finally told Voss. "Rage is messy. This is reverence. Whoever did this didn't want to destroy her. They wanted to preserve something, a version of her, frozen exactly the way they needed her to be." Preserve her for who? Voss asked. Kessler's answer would become the central question of the entire investigation. For himself, or, and this is the part that should worry you, for someone he wanted to impress. 3 weeks into the investigation, a name surfaced that seemed almost immediately to crack the case wide open. Harlan Boyce, age 41, lived alone on a property bordering the old mill. A loner with a history of minor offenses, trespassing, an assault charge from over a decade earlier that had been pled down, Harlan fit the profile of a small-town outsider that investigators, and frankly the public, were eager to blame. He had no alibi for the window of Marlene's disappearance. He'd been seen near the mill property multiple times in the months prior, and when officers searched his home, they found something that made the entire department's pulse spike: a storage shed containing candles, dozens of them, various colors. For 9 days, Harlan Boyce was Hollow Creek's prime suspect. The local newspaper ran his photograph above the fold. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to him for years suddenly had detailed memories of his strange behavior. The case, for a moment, felt solved. It wasn't. The candles in Harlan's shed, it turned out, were leftover stock from a craft business his late mother had run for 20 years before her death. Dust-covered, untouched, completely unrelated to the 9 specific candles found at the crime scene, which forensic analysis showed had been purchased from a specialty supplier with locations in only 4 cities across the entire region, none of them anywhere near Hollow Creek. More importantly, when Voss pulled Harlan's cell phone records, his location data placed him 60 miles away at a Veterans Affairs clinic during the exact 48-hour window when the toxicology report indicated Marlene had been poisoned. Harlan Boyce was released without charge. He sued the department for wrongful public exposure and won a modest settlement. He left Hollow Creek less than a year later and was never connected to the case again. The real perpetrator, investigators would come to believe, had been watching the entire spectacle unfold from somewhere very close by and had likely enjoyed every second of it. The break came 8 months later, and it came from an unlikely source: a graduate student in forensic statistics named Priya Anand, who had been quietly cross-referencing unsolved cases across the tri-state region as part of her thesis work. Priya noticed something the original task force had missed, because the original task force had no reason to look beyond Hollow Creek's borders. In the 4 years prior to Marlene Castillo's death, 3 other women in 3 different states, in 3 towns that had nothing obviously connecting them, had died under strikingly similar circumstances. Each was found posed, untouched by violence, surrounded by an odd number of candles burned exactly halfway down. Each had been reported missing for roughly a week before being discovered. Each toxicology report, when Priya tracked them down, indicated the same rare compound. None of these cases had been classified as homicides at the time. 2 had been ruled accidental poisonings. 1 had been left officially undetermined. Priya brought her findings to a regional FBI field office, and within weeks, what had been a single small-town murder investigation became a multi-state task force, eventually designated under the internal name Operation Quiet Hour, a reference, investigators later admitted, to the unnerving stillness at the center of every single scene. A pattern this precise meant one thing. This was not a single act of violence. It was a signature. And signatures only exist because someone wants them to be recognized, eventually, by someone. The question that now consumed Detective Voss, Dr. Kessler, and the entire task force was no longer just who did this, but a far stranger. Who was the audience this killer had been performing for all along? 14 months into Operation Quiet Hour, the answer arrived unprompted and addressed directly to Detective Renata Voss. It came as a typed letter, postmarked from a city 300 miles away, with no return address. Forensic document examiners found no fingerprints, no DNA, no identifiable watermark on the paper. The envelope had been sealed using a sponge, not saliva. Every possible forensic avenue had been anticipated and closed off in advance. The letter read, in part, "You found 4. There were others before them that you will never find, and there will be others after, because you were looking for a man, and I am not what you think I am. I built this for someone who is gone now, and I no longer need an audience to finish it for me. Marlene was the last one. You may stop looking, but you will not stop thinking about her, will you?" It was signed with a single symbol, a circle bisected by a line, the same shape, investigators realized with a chill, formed by the positioning of the 9 candles at every single scene when viewed from above. The letter changed everything about the case's psychological profile. Dr. Kessler's read was this: the killer wasn't performing for police, the media, or even the public. The audience was a single person, someone now dead or gone, who the killer had once been trying to please, impress, or perhaps grieve through this elaborate, horrifying ritual. Each victim wasn't chosen at random. Each one, investigators eventually confirmed through painstaking background work, bore a resemblance, not physical, but circumstantial, to a woman who had died under tragic, unrelated circumstances exactly 9 years before the first known victim. A teacher, beloved by her community, engaged to be married, dead before her wedding day. Her name, buried in an old county record, was Eleanor Voss, Detective Renata Voss's older sister. This is the part of the story that, when it finally became public, made headlines far beyond Hollow Creek. Eleanor Voss had died 17 years earlier in what was, at the time, ruled a tragic accidental poisoning, eating wild mushrooms misidentified during a camping trip. Renata had been 22. The death had shaped the entire trajectory of her life. It was, in fact, the reason she joined law enforcement in the first place. Renata had never told anyone on the task force about her sister. There had been no reason to. The case was 17 years old, ruled accidental, filed away in a county that wasn't even part of the current investigation's jurisdiction. But someone had known. Someone had remembered Eleanor Voss, had perhaps loved her in a way that curdled over nearly 2 decades into something monstrous, and had spent 4 years recreating her death over and over on different women, in different towns, as a kind of obsessive, grief-soaked ritual aimed, ultimately, at being seen by the one detective whose life had been permanently altered by the original loss. The killer wasn't performing for the public. He was performing for Renata Voss specifically, long before she ever picked up the Marlene Castillo case, because he had engineered, through patient and patient research, for that exact case to land on her desk. Hollow Creek wasn't random. Marlene Castillo wasn't random. Voss's involvement wasn't random. It was the final, intended step of a 17-year plan. When this realization hit the task force, Operation Quiet Hour pivoted entirely. Investigators went back through Eleanor Voss's old case file, and this time, with modern forensic techniques unavailable in the original investigation. Retested preserved tissue samples that had almost miraculously been retained in a county evidence locker far longer than required by retention policy. The toxin matched. Eleanor Vuss had not died by accident. She had been the first victim, the original. And the trail of phone records, postal routing data, and a single retained partial print on the inside seal of the very first envelope eventually led investigators to a name that, for Renata Voss personally, was almost impossible to absorb. Thomas Reyes, a former classmate of Eleanor's from nearly 2 decades earlier, a man who had once quietly and unrequitedly loved her and who had never recovered from her death, nor from the rejection that preceded it by less than a year. Thomas Reyes was arrested in a small rented house 400 miles away, where investigators found a sealed room containing photographs, news clippings, and a shrine-like arrangement that mirrored, in miniature, the crime scenes investigators had spent over a year piecing together. He did not resist arrest. He reportedly said only one thing to the arresting officers: "Tell her I'm sorry. It took this long for her to understand." Thomas Reyes was ultimately linked, through physical evidence and his own eventual confession, to 7 deaths across 4 states, spanning 19 years, making it, at the time, one of the longest-running and most psychologically calculated serial cases in the region's history. He was deemed competent to stand trial and was convicted on all counts. He offered no defense beyond a single chilling statement read into the court record: that he had not seen himself as taking lives, but as finishing a story that was interrupted too soon. A sentiment forensic psychologists would spend years afterward dissecting in academic literature on obsessive grief and delayed onset offender pathology. Detective Renata Voss did not testify at the sentencing. She requested, and was granted, reassignment away from the case before its conclusion, a decision colleagues described as the only time in 14 years they'd seen her step back from anything. She eventually returned to active duty. She never spoke publicly about her sister's connection to the case, and what's recounted here comes only from later court records made public after the trial concluded. Hollow Creek, for its part, returned to being the kind of town where nothing happens. The Ash Grove Mill was finally demolished 2 years after Marlene Castillo's body was found there. Not for any investigative reason, but because, as the town council put it in their official notice, it was time. What remains unanswered, even now, is the question Dr. Kessler raised on day 1 of the investigation: who was the audience? The unsettling answer, in the end, was that there were 2. Eleanor Vuss, who never knew she was being honored in this way, and Renata Voss, who spent 14 months chasing a ghost that turned out to be standing the entire time directly behind her. The Hollow Creek case remains, among the investigators who worked it, the single most disturbing file any of them ever closed. Not for its violence, which was almost entirely absent, but for its patience. For the 17 years one man spent constructing a story no one else was meant to read until the very end. If this story kept you up tonight, that was the intention. Stories like this remind us that the most dangerous people are rarely the loudest in the room. Sometimes, they're simply the ones willing to wait the longest. Thank you for watching. If you want more deep dive mystery thrillers like this one, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next case is already waiting to be told.